They threw her out on the coldest night of the year. No coat, no food, no mercy. They dragged her to the edge of Stonefang Pack territory, dumped her in the frozen dirt, and told her that Omegas who could not shift were worth less than the ground she was kneeling on. They told her she would be dead by morning. They told her the forest would finish what her uselessness had started. They told her the pack did not mourn what it had never valued. Then they walked back inside their warm pack house and locked the gates. They were wrong about the mourning. They were wrong about almost everything. Because what they did not know, what no one had bothered to look closely enough to discover, was that Zara Voss had been holding back her shift for 3 years. Not because she could not shift. Because the last time she had felt it rising, at the age of 19, the wolf that had come forward had been so enormous and so ancient and so terrifyingly powerful that she had pushed it back down with every piece of herself and locked it somewhere so deep that even she could not always hear it. She had been protecting them from it, and they had thanked her by throwing her into the snow. Now she is alone in a forest that wants to kill her. Now the wolf she buried is rising again, and this time there is nothing left worth protecting them from. Now every alpha in the Northern Territory is about to learn what the Stonefang Pack threw away. And one alpha in particular is about to find out that the most powerful mate his bloodline will ever produce was not born into a palace. She was born in the dirt. And she got back up. Subscribe, comment, share, like. Hit subscribe right now before this story goes any further, because once chapter 1 starts you are not going to want to stop and the next chapter. Leave a comment telling us what you think is going to happen to Zara. Share this with someone who needs a wolf heroine who does not beg for anything. Like the video so more people can find the story. Do all of it right now and then keep watching because everything begins on the next line. Chapter 1. The night they threw her away. The ground was frozen solid and it bit through her thin pack-issue tunic the moment her knees hit it. Zara Voss did not cry out. She had learned a very long time ago that sounds of pain were an invitation in the Stonefang Pack, and not the kind of invitation you wanted to accept. She absorbed the impact across her palms and her kneecaps and the sharp cold of the earth, and she pressed her teeth together, and she breathed through it, and she looked up from the frozen mud at the 4 wolves who had carried her out here, and she made sure her face showed them nothing. Nothing was the only armor she had left. Riker Cole, the beta who had overseen her punishment detail for the last 3 years, stood at the front of the group with his arms crossed and his expression carrying the particular satisfaction of a man who believed very sincerely that cruelty delivered in the name of pack order was a form of service. He was broad and fair-haired and had the kind of physical confidence that came from never once having been on the losing side of a confrontation, which was itself a consequence of always choosing opponents he knew he could beat. He had always chosen Zara. He said she had until dawn to leave Stonefang territory or what came next would be official rather than informal. He said the forest had enough wolves in it that her scent would be tracked and finished before she reached the second ridge. He said she should have shifted at her assessment like every other wolf instead of standing there like a broken thing that wasted the pack healer's time. Zara said nothing. He crouched down to her level, the way a man crouches down to something smaller than himself to make absolutely certain it understands the distance between them, and he said that Alpha Doran had personally signed the exile order. That this was not Riker's choice or the Pack Council's recommendation. That even the Alpha himself had looked at her file, at 3 years of failed shift assessments and marginal pack contributions, and the stubborn refusal to simply disappear quietly the way unwanted Omegas usually did, and had decided she was not worth the resources she consumed. Zara held his gaze. She held it with the amber-flecked dark eyes that she had inherited from a mother she could not remember, and she held it with the particular quality of stillness that people had been misreading as submission for as long as she had been alive. And she let him see absolutely nothing of what was happening in her chest. What was happening in her chest was not nothing. What was happening in her chest was the thing she had been pressing down for 3 years, the thing that had started the night she turned 19 and stood in the assessment circle and felt the wolf rise in her like a tide that had been building since before she could walk. The wolf that was not a standard Stonefang shift. The wolf that was enormous and dark and carried in its bones a kind of authority that had nothing to do with pack rank and everything to do with something much older, something that ran in bloodlines the current generation of wolves had long since stopped believing in. She had pushed it back down. She had pushed it back down because she was 19 and alone, and the one thing she understood about the Stofong pack was that they destroyed anything they could not control. And if that wolf came forward in that assessment circle, there would be no controlling it and no hiding what it was, and she would spend whatever remained of her life being used as a weapon or eliminated as a threat. So she had pretended she could not shift. And they had given her 3 years of labor assignments, 3 years of Riker Cole's boot on her neck in various configurations, 3 years of surviving on the margins of a community that had collectively decided she was substandard. And then they had thrown her out into the cold and told her the forest would finish the job. Riker stood, having received whatever confirmation of his own significance he had come out here looking for, and turned back toward the packhouse with the other 3 wolves falling into step behind him. None of them looked back. Zara stayed on her knees until the sound of the gate closing reached her, a deep resonant clang of iron that was not quite loud enough to be a statement, but was precisely loud enough to be final. Then she rose slowly, not because her body needed the slowness, but because she was giving herself the seconds required to assess her situation with the clarity it deserved rather than the panic it invited. The forest was 300 meters ahead across open ground. The temperature was dropping and would continue to drop until approximately 3 in the morning before it began to ease, which gave her a window of roughly 6 hours of the most dangerous cold. She had no coat. She had the clothes she had been wearing during the afternoon work rotation, thin utility trousers and a long-sleeve tunic in the dark gray of standard Omega labor issue, worn boots, and nothing else. She had, however, survived worse than this. Not in temperature. In the specific concentrated effort that another person can put into ending you when they have decided to commit to it. She had survived Riker's punishments. She had survived 3 pack assessments knowing that the truth of what she was would destroy her if it came out. She had survived the daily architecture of being considered worthless by the only community she had ever known. She had survived by being smarter than the situation she was in. She began to walk toward the forest. The first kilometer was open ground, and the wind was vicious and lateral and found every gap in her clothing with the efficiency of something that had been practicing for exactly this encounter. Her hands were numb before she reached the tree line. Her face had gone past the burning stage and into the deeper cold where sensation becomes unreliable. She entered the forest and the wind dropped by half, replaced by the specific dense silence of old-growth trees in winter, and she made decisions quickly. The first decision was fire. Not because fire was always the right choice in a forest with predators, but because hypothermia would kill her before any predator found her, and the calculation was therefore straightforward. The second decision was elevation. Higher ground gave her sight lines and reduced her scent trail moving downwind. The third decision, the one she had been circling since her knees hit the frozen mud and had been avoiding looking at directly, was about the wolf. She sat down at the base of a spruce tree that was wide enough to provide a windbreak, and she pressed her back against it, and she closed her eyes, and she went inward. The wolf was not waiting the way it usually waited, patient and contained and aware of the agreement they had made. The wolf was awake. It had been awake since the gate closed. It was pacing in the deep interior place where she kept it, and its eyes were open, and its attention was entirely on the cold and the dark and the situation Zara had placed them both in. She said, silently and internally, that she was aware of the situation. The wolf said nothing because wolves did not use words. But it sent back something that was not quite an image and not quite a feeling, and was instead the specific communication of a creature that had been patient for 3 years and was now presenting a clear and uncomplicated case for why patience was no longer the appropriate response to their circumstances. Zara opened her eyes. She looked at her numb hands against her knees, the calloused palms and the chapped knuckles of 3 years of labor assignments, and she thought about everything she had protected the Stofong pack from, and what they had given her in return for that protection. She thought about Riker Cole walking away without looking back. She thought about Alpha Doran signing an exile order for a woman whose file said she could not shift, not knowing that the reason she could not shift was that what lived inside her would crack his entire understanding of the wolf hierarchy in half. She thought about the cold. Then she stopped thinking, and she stopped holding on, and she let the wolf come. What happened next was not the way shifts were supposed to happen. Standard shift was a process. It had a sequence. There was the initial pull of the transformation, the restructuring of bone and tissue, the emergence of the animal form from the human one in a progression that took between 45 seconds and 2 minutes depending on the wolf and the circumstances. It was loud and it was violent and it was visible, and it left the wolf standing on the ground where the human had been, oriented and aware and carrying the instincts of the animal in the architecture of the body. What Zara experienced was not a process. It was a detonation. One moment she was sitting against the spruce tree with her numb hands in her lap and the cold pressing in from every direction. The next moment the wolf came forward, not in stages, but all at once, not through her but as her, not replacing the human, but revealing what had always been underneath the human. And the forest shook with the displacement of air, and the spruce tree behind her shed its snow load in a single sudden cascade, and the ground registered the impact of something landing on it that weighed considerably more than a standard wolf. Zara stood on 4 legs in the winter forest and breathed. She was the color of deep water at night, black with an undertone that in certain light suggested the blue-black of old ink, and she was large. Not large the way a big wolf was large, impressive, and obvious within the normal range of variation. Large the way mountains are large, in a way that changed the scale of everything around her. The trees that had been tall were still tall, but they were now context rather than environment. The forest floor that had been the ground was now something she stood above rather than on. She shook herself once, a full body movement that was both physical calibration and something more fundamental, the specific act of a creature that has been folded up for 3 years, finally extending itself to its full dimensions. Then she lifted her head and she breathed in the night. The forest came to her in layers. The cold was the first layer, present and intense and no longer a threat because the cold that had been killing her from the outside was now simply weather, information rather than enemy. Beneath the cold was the forest itself, the deep green dark scent of old spruce and frozen earth, and the faint mineral tang of ice forming on still water somewhere to the northeast. Beneath the forest was the life in it, the small warm signatures of rabbits in their burrows and a fox moving half a kilometer west, and the distant cluster of warm scents that meant a deer herd bedded down for the night. And beneath all of it, faint and receding but unmistakably there, the scent of 4 Stofong wolves moving back toward a packhouse that had no idea what it had just released into the world. Zara turned north. She ran. Not because she was fleeing. She had stopped fleeing the moment she stopped holding the wolf back. She ran because running was what the body wanted after 3 years of compression, because the forest at night was exactly the right scale for what she now was. Because the cold that had been trying to kill her was now simply the air moving past her face as she accelerated through the trees with the particular fluid efficiency of something that was not fighting its environment, but moving through it the way it was designed to. She ran until the Stonefong Pack territory was behind her. She ran until the trees opened onto a ridge that looked out over a valley she did not recognize, lit faintly by the moon coming through the cloud cover, with the dark shapes of mountains on 3 sides, and the distant yellow warmth of lights that meant settlement somewhere in the valley floor. She sat on the ridge and looked at the valley, and the wolf was entirely calm and entirely present and entirely certain. Whatever came next, she was facing it as herself. For the first time in 3 years, all of herself. This story is not finished with you yet. Subscribe right now, leave a comment, and tell us what you think of Zara. Is she the strongest Omega you have ever watched, or is she something the wolf world has never seen before? Share this story with every person you know who deserves a wolf romance that hits like a fist and holds like a home. Like the video. Comment your thoughts. Share it everywhere. Every single one of those actions keeps this story alive. Subscribe. Like. Comment. Share. Chapter 2. The Alpha Who Smelled the Storm. Caius Wren had been alpha of the Greymoor pack for 7 years, and in that time had developed what his head beta sable called an unhealthy relationship with the Northern Ridge. He came up here when something was wrong and he could not identify the source. He came up here when something was right and he needed to understand why. He came up here at 3 in the morning with his hands in the pockets of his long charcoal coat when the pack house felt too organized and too managed and too full of the specific weight of 160 wolves looking to him for the steadiness that leadership required him to maintain regardless of his internal weather. He had been up here for 2 hours when the wind shifted. He knew what it was before he understood what it was. His wolf registered it first, a full-body alert that was not fear and was not aggression and was not any of the standard signals that came with a genuine threat, but was instead something much rarer and considerably more disorienting. His wolf went completely and immediately still in the way that wolves went still, not when they were frightened, but when they had encountered something their entire nervous system needed to pay absolute attention to. Caius lifted his face into the wind and breathed. The scent that came back to him was complex and layered and should not have been coming from the ridge that bordered the edge of unclaimed forest between Greymoor territory and the dead zone that separated them from the Stonefang pack to the south. The top layer was winter forest, clean and cold, and carrying the particular clarity of a night with dropping temperatures. Beneath that was something warm, which was unusual because warmth in that direction at this hour was unusual. And beneath the warmth was something that his wolf recognized before his mind caught up. Something ancient and deep and carrying in its composition a frequency that Caius had only ever read about in the bloodline texts he had studied as a young alpha, learning the full scope of what wolf genetics could theoretically produce. He was moving before he made a decision to move. Down the interior face of the ridge, through the trees that bordered the northern edge of Greymoor territory, toward the boundary line that his wolves maintained as the edge of their range. He moved at speed, but not full sprint, the kind of controlled urgency that kept him functional rather than reactive, and his wolf was fully present and fully engaged in a way it had not been in years. He heard her before he saw her. Not a sound she made. She was entirely silent. What he heard was the forest, specifically the quality of the forest's silence on the other side of the boundary. The particular absence of small animal movement and night bird sound that indicated something large and significant was present on the ridge above the tree line. He came out of the trees and stopped. She was sitting on the ridge against a rock, human formed now and looking out over the valley with an expression he could not fully read from this angle. She was wearing Stonefang labor issue, the dark gray utility clothing of a pack worker, thin and entirely wrong for the current temperature. Her hair was dark and loose around her shoulders. She was not shivering, which told him something. And the scent that had pulled him across his own territory in the middle of the night was coming from her with an intensity that up close was almost overwhelming. Not overwhelming in a dangerous way. Overwhelming in the way of something that his wolf had apparently been waiting his entire life to encounter and was now reacting to with a thoroughness that temporarily reorganized his ability to think about anything else. He stood at the edge of the tree line and he said, quietly enough not to startle, but clearly enough to be heard, that she was sitting on the boundary of Greymoor pack territory and he needed to know who she was and where she had come from before either of them took another step in any direction. She turned. He saw her face clearly for the first time, the amber-flecked dark eyes and the strong features and the particular expression of someone who was assessing him with exactly the same level of attention he was giving her. Not the wary appraisal of someone who expected to be in danger, but the careful intelligence of someone deciding how much information to release and in what sequence. She said her name was Zara Voss. She said she had been a member of the Stonefang pack as of approximately 4 hours ago. She said she was no longer affiliated with the Stonefang pack and had no intention of claiming their protection or their problems as her own going forward. She said she had shifted for the first time on the ridge above his territory, and she was aware of the implications of that, and she was not attempting to deceive him about any of it. Caius absorbed this. He said the Stonefang pack was 3 territories to the south. She said she was aware of that. He said she had covered that distance in approximately 4 hours after shifting for the first time. She said she was aware of that too. He said she was sitting in the wind on his territory boundary at 3 in the morning in laborer-grade clothing in below-freezing temperatures, and she did not appear to be in physical distress. She said she was somewhat cold. He looked at her for a moment. His wolf was doing something it had never done before in 7 years of his leadership of the Greymoor pack. It was attempting to move toward her. Not in the way his wolf moved toward a threat, or toward a pack member requiring protection, or toward any of the categories of wolf behavior he had experienced in his 31 years. It was moving toward her the way a lodestone moves toward north, with the specific certainty of something that has located the one-directional pole that matters and is now simply oriented. He knew what it was. He had read about it. Every alpha read about it. The mate bond was documented in every bloodline text with varying degrees of credibility, described sometimes as mystical and sometimes as genetic and sometimes as the specific alignment of two wolf natures that were complementary at a level below conscious experience. He had always categorized it as probable but theoretical, the kind of thing that happened to bloodlines in old stories. It was apparently happening to his bloodline on the northern ridge at 3 in the morning. He removed his coat. He walked to where she was sitting, and he held it out, and he said that whatever conversation they were going to have about who she was and what she was doing on his territory boundary, she was going to have it without becoming hypothermic because her hands were showing the early signs, and he was not prepared to manage a medical situation on top of everything else this night was presenting him with. Zara looked at the coat. She looked at him. Then she took the coat and put it on, and the hem fell almost to her knees, and the shoulders were considerably wider than hers, and she looked, in the charcoal wool that smelled of Greymoor pack, and something more specific than that, like someone who had just been given something she was not entirely sure she was allowed to trust yet. He sat down on the rock beside her, not close enough to crowd her, close enough to communicate that he was not going anywhere. He said she should tell him everything. And Zara Voss, who had not told anyone the truth in 3 years, looked out over the valley below the ridge and considered the man sitting beside her and the wolf that was entirely calm in her chest for reasons she was not ready to examine directly. And she began to speak. She told him about the assessment at 19. She told him what had come up when she opened to the shift and why she had pushed it back down. She told him about the 3 years of labor assignments and the file that said failed Omega. No shift capability and the slow persistent machinery of being treated as less than nothing by people who did not know they had something ancient and enormous living in the work rotation right alongside them. She told him about Riker Cole and the exile order and the frozen ground and the gate closing behind her. She told him about letting the wolf come in the forest. She told him she did not know what she was doing next, or where she was going, or what the shape of the life she was building now was supposed to look like. She told him she had exactly no resources, no pack affiliation, no plan beyond surviving the night. And she was telling him all of this not because she was asking for anything but because he had asked for the truth and she had decided that honesty was the appropriate currency for whatever this was. Caius listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, the valley was still dark below them and the moon had moved and the temperature had dropped another degree. He was sitting in his shirt sleeves and the cold was irrelevant because alphas ran warm and he was currently running considerably warmer than usual for reasons his wolf was entirely transparent about. He said he had one question. She waited. He said the wolf that came forward in the forest tonight. He needed her to tell him what it felt like from the inside. Not what it looked like. He could assess that from her scent and the evidence of how she had covered 3 territories in 4 hours. He needed to know what she experienced when she shifted because the answer to that question was going to determine several things about what happened next. Zara was quiet for a moment. Then she said it felt like putting something down that she had been carrying for so long she had started to believe the weight was her own body. She said it felt like a door opening that she had been leaning against for 3 years, and when it finally opened she did not fall through it, she walked through it. She said the wolf was not separate from her. It was the oldest and most complete version of her. It knew things she did not know and remembered things she could not access in human form, and it had been patient in the way that only something very old and very certain can be patient. She paused. She said it felt like herself. Caius closed his eyes for a moment. Then he said he was going to take her back to the Greymoor packhouse. He said she would be given shelter and food and a formal offer of temporary pack affiliation while she decided what she wanted to do next. He said no one in his pack would ask her to demonstrate her shift or her capabilities or perform her worth for anyone's benefit. He said he was making this offer as the alpha of the Greymoor pack and as a man who had just heard a story that had implications he was still processing and needed to process somewhere warmer than a mountain ridge. He said there was one more thing. She looked at him. He said he was aware that something was happening between their wolves, and he was not going to pretend otherwise, because pretending would be an insult to her intelligence and to whatever this was. He said he was not going to act on it without her permission or push it toward a conclusion she had not chosen. He said she had arrived on his territory boundary 4 hours out of an exile that she did not deserve, and the last thing she needed was another person making decisions about her future without her input. He said he was simply naming it so they were both clear about what was in the room. Zara looked at him for a long moment with those amber-flecked dark eyes that had been reading situations accurately for 22 years and missing very little. Then she said she appreciated the clarity. She stood and he stood, and they walked down off the ridge together in the early morning dark, and the wolf in Zara's chest was warm and certain and entirely unafraid. And the valley below them held its breath the way valleys do when something significant is passing through them. Chapter 3. What the pack did not expect. The Greymoor packhouse sat at the center of the valley like something that had grown there rather than been built. All dark timber and pale stone with the mountain at its back and the river at its feet and a surrounding settlement of pack buildings that indicated a community of genuine size and complexity. Zara saw it as they came down the last slope of the approach road in the gray light just before dawn, and she cataloged it the way she cataloged everything, quickly and in detail, and with attention to the things that told you about the culture of a place rather than just its dimensions. The training grounds were large and well-maintained and positioned to be used, not displayed. The community buildings had light in the windows at this hour, which meant either early risers or a pack culture that did not enforce rigid schedules, both of which told her something. The packhouse gate was iron but stood open. That last detail was the most significant. A pack that left its gate open at 4 in the morning either had nothing to fear from outside or trusted its members to manage entry and exit without administrative control. In Stofong, the gates were closed at nightfall and the closing was a statement. Here the open gate was a different kind of statement, and she was still deciding what to do with it when Caius brought the vehicle to a stop in the main courtyard and his head beta came out of the packhouse door with the expression of someone who had been waiting and had questions. Sable was in her early 30s, lean and dark-skinned and silver-streaked with the kind of early gray that came from genetics rather than age, with quick dark eyes that moved from Caius to Zara and back to Caius in a single assessment sweep and landed on a conclusion that she was visibly reserving until she had more data. Caius said this was Zara Voss, formerly of the Stofong pack, currently requiring shelter and the guest protocol. He said he would explain in full in the morning after they had both slept, and he wanted Sable to arrange a room in the east wing and make sure the kitchen knew there was someone who had not eaten since yesterday. Sable said the word formerly with exactly the intonation of someone who had noticed approximately 11 things and was choosing not to say any of them yet. She said of course, and she said welcome to Greymoor, and she said it to Zara directly with the particular quality of someone who meant what they said even when they had additional thoughts they were not sharing, and then she led Zara inside. The interior of the packhouse was warm with the specific layered warmth of a building that had been lived in continuously for a long time, all dark wood and worn stone floors and walls that held the accumulation of decades of pack life. Zara followed Sable up a staircase and down a corridor that was wide enough for 2 wolves to pass without the communication of territory that narrow corridors required. And she was shown into a room that was not large, but was clean and warm, and had a window that looked east toward where the sky was beginning to gray at its lowest edge. Sable paused at the door. She said she was going to ask one question, and after that she would leave Zara to rest. Zara said she was listening. Sable said she had been Caius's head beta for 5 years, and in that time she had learned to read the specific quality of his body language with considerable accuracy. She said the quality she had seen in the courtyard was something she had not seen in 5 years of close observation. She said she was not asking for information Zara did not want to share. She was simply saying that whatever had happened on that ridge, she was glad it had, and she wanted Zara to know that Greymoor was not Stofong, and that whatever the next few days looked like, she would not be facing them without people who were already paying attention. Zara looked at this woman who had known her for approximately 4 minutes and had just offered her something it had taken the entirety of her time in Stofong to stop hoping for. She said she understood. She said thank you. Sable nodded and left, and Zara sat on the edge of the bed in the East Wing room and looked at her hands and breathed until the size of the last 12 hours began to settle into something she could hold without it pulling her under. She slept for 6 hours. She woke to the sound of the pack moving through its morning below her window, the overlapping sounds of a community doing the work of being a community, and she sat up and looked at the room in the full morning light and made some decisions. The first decision was that she was not going to be grateful in the way that made her small. She had not done anything to deserve what the Stofong pack had done to her, and she had not done anything to earn the particular way this morning felt different from every morning of the last 3 years. And she was not going to internalize either outcome as a reflection of her worth. She was worth the same amount in both places. What was different was the places. The second decision was that she was going to be honest. Not the performed honesty of someone managing an impression. The actual honesty of someone who had spent 3 years being something other than herself and was not interested in continuing that project in new surroundings. The third decision was the one she had been circling since she sat on the rock beside Caius Wren and felt her wolf settle in a way it had never settled in proximity to another person. She was going to allow herself to be aware of it without letting it override her judgment. The bond was real. She was not naive enough to dismiss what she had felt or what she had read on his face when he sat down beside her. But she was also a person who had just spent 3 years having her autonomy systematically removed by a community that had decided she was theirs to define, and she was not immediately trading that experience for a new set of definitions from a different direction, even a direction that her wolf found entirely compelling. She washed her face and she went downstairs. The packhouse kitchen was large and occupied and produced the kind of breakfast that indicated a culture that took feeding its people seriously. And a young pack member named Theo, who could not have been more than 17, pointed her toward a seat at the long kitchen table and put a plate in front of her with the uncomplicated hospitality of someone who had been raised to believe that feeding a guest was simply what you did, and Zara ate in silence and let the sounds of the kitchen move around her and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Safe. Not safe because nothing could hurt her. Safe because the environment was not itself the threat. Caius found her in the training yard an hour later. She had located it without asking anyone where it was, following the sounds of movement and impact through the eastern side of the packhouse complex. And she had been watching the morning training session for 20 minutes with her arms folded and her back against the fence, and the specific quality of attention she gave things she was learning. The session was good. Not showy, not performance-oriented, not the kind of training that existed to demonstrate hierarchy. It was functional and hard, and everyone in the yard was genuinely working. Caius stood beside her at the fence. He had slept, she could tell, and changed into dark training clothes, the kind worn and broken in from actual use, and he was looking at the yard with the eye of someone who had designed what he was watching and was checking it against his intentions. He said she was welcome to join if she wanted. She said she would watch for today. He nodded. Then he said he had spoken with his council that morning. He said the full story of what the Stofong pack had done, including the falsified assessment records that allowed them to classify her as shift-incapable and justify the exile, was going to be formally documented and submitted to the Northern Territory Oversight Body. He said she did not have to do anything with that information. He was simply making sure she had it. She said she appreciated that. He said there was something else. She waited. He said word had reached him that morning that the Stofong pack had put out a tracking request. Not an official one through proper channels. An informal request to the two packs that bordered their southern and eastern territories, asking them to flag any unaffiliated wolf matching her description on the grounds that she had left with pack property. Zara turned to look at him. He said he wanted her to know that the request had been declined. That Greymoor did not participate in informal tracking arrangements outside official protocol, and that the description the Stofong pack had circulated was of a female Omega, shift incapable, dangerous due to instability. He let that sit for a moment. She said they were going to find out very quickly that the description was inaccurate. He said yes. He said that was something they needed to discuss. He said the moment her shift was registered through official channels, which would happen automatically when she formally affiliated with any pack, the Stofong pack's falsified assessment records would be contradicted by hard evidence and the situation would escalate. He said he was not telling her this to pressure her into any particular decision. He was telling her because she deserved to understand the full shape of the situation she was in. Zara looked at the training yard. She watched a young female wolf execute a ground defense that was technically excellent but slightly overextended at the conclusion, leaving a gap she would need to correct. She said she wanted to tell him something. He said he was listening. She said she had not shifted in 3 years because she was protecting the Stofong pack from what would come forward if she did. She said she was aware that what came forward last night in the forest was not a standard wolf. She said she did not entirely know the full scope of what she was capable of, and she was not interested in performing it for anyone's benefit or using it as currency to buy herself a place in a new hierarchy. She said she wanted to be here as a person, not as a classified asset. If that was a problem for Greymoor, she would rather know now. Caius looked at her for a long moment. Then he said that the Greymoor pack had 160 wolves in it, and not one of them had been asked to justify their presence by demonstrating their capabilities. He said that was not how he ran his pack, and it was not how he intended to start. He said she was welcome here as a person. He said the rest would sort itself out. Zara looked back at the training yard. She said there was a gap in the young female wolf's ground defense at the conclusion of the sequence. Caius looked at the yard. He said he saw it. He said she was right. And something shifted between them in the way that things shift when two people have begun, through a series of small honest exchanges, to understand the actual shape of each other. Not performed. Not rushed. Simply beginning, with the careful attention of two people who knew that what they were building had enough weight to it that the foundation mattered. Chapter 4. Blood on the Snow. The Stofong pack came on the 14th day. Not with an official envoy or a formal challenge under Northern Territory protocol. They came the way packs come when they are not interested in protocol and not worried about consequences, with 12 wolves in combat shift moving through the forest on the eastern edge of Greymoor territory before dawn, 3 hours before the pack's early patrol rotation would have picked up their scent trail. Zara was already awake. She had been awake since 2 in the morning with the specific quality of alertness that her wolf produced when something in the environment was not right. A low persistent signal that was not quite sound and not quite scent and was entirely impossible to dismiss once it started. She had been sitting at her window watching the dark edge of the eastern forest for an hour when the signal resolved into something she could name. Stofong. She was moving through the packhouse corridor before she had fully articulated the decision to move, and she was at Caius's door and knocking with the flat of her hand and calling his name before the instinct had finished converting itself into language. The door opened in seconds, which told her he had been partially awake himself, and he read her face and his own shifted into the particular focused clarity of an alpha who has just had his threat assessment confirmed and is now organizing a response. He said how many? She said 12, eastern edge, already inside the first tree line, combat shift. He said how she knew. She said her wolf had been tracking them for an hour, and she could not fully explain the mechanism, but she was certain. He held her gaze for exactly 2 seconds, and then he moved, and the decision he had made in those 2 seconds was visible in how he moved, which was without any of the hesitation that would have indicated he was still processing whether to trust her read of the situation. He trusted it completely. That did something to Zara that she did not have time to sit with, but filed carefully for later. The Greymore early warning system activated with an efficiency that indicated it had been designed and practiced rather than hoped for, the specific coordinated response of a pack that took its defensive protocols seriously. Within 8 minutes there were 23 wolves in combat shift positioned along the eastern perimeter, 6 more in secondary positions covering the packhouse approaches, and Sable coordinating the non-combat members toward the interior shelter positions with the calm authority of someone who had run this drill enough times that it was not a drill anymore. Caius stood at the eastern perimeter with his senior wolves around him. Zara stood 12 feet to his left. He had not told her to stand there. She had positioned herself there because the threat assessment her wolf was providing indicated that the eastern perimeter approach had a secondary gap on the left flank that the current deployment did not fully cover, and she was covering it. It was a tactical decision. It was also, she was aware, a statement about where she stood relative to this pack and this man, and she was making it with full understanding of what it meant. The Stofong wolves came out of the tree line at speed. 12 of them, dark shapes moving fast through the pre-dawn gray, and Zara recognized the formation. She had seen Riker Cole run this pattern in training exercises, a pincer approach designed to split a defensive line at the center and collapse both halves before they could regroup. It was effective against a standard defensive response. It was less effective against a defense that had already identified the formation and adjusted. The Greymore wolves held the line. What happened next was not a clean engagement. It was a wolf fight in winter dark, and wolf fights were not clean. There was impact and noise and the specific brutal efficiency of animals that were built for exactly this application of their capabilities. Caius was in it immediately, and the quality of his presence in a fight was something Zara had not seen before and processed in real time with the part of her brain that cataloged information regardless of circumstances. He was not the biggest wolf in the engagement, but he moved with an economy that suggested someone who had internalized the geometry of a fight so thoroughly that he was always where the exchange needed him to be rather than where the chaos was directing everyone else. The left flank opened. 3 Stofong wolves broke from the main engagement and angled toward the gap that Zara had been covering. And she understood in the specific clear way of a moment when everything becomes simple that this was the moment her wolf had been building toward since the forest. She let it come. This shift was not the detonation of the first time. It was something she chose, deliberately and completely, and it was faster than the first time, the wolf coming forward in the time it took to exhale. And she was standing on the left flank of the Greymore defensive line in the form that had spent 3 years in the dark and was now entirely present in the world. The 3 Stofong wolves stopped moving. It was involuntary. She understood that it was involuntary because she recognized the response. It was the response of wolves encountering something their instincts classified as belonging to a different tier of the hierarchy than the one they had been operating in. The specific and immediate recalibration of a creature that has just encountered something it did not know was in the room. One of the 3 was Riker Cole. She knew his scent even in shift. She knew it the way you know the scent of the person who has put their boot on your neck for 3 years, with the particular clarity of something that has been registered under duress and therefore stored with unusual depth. She held the flank. She did not advance. She did not perform threat. She stood on the left flank of the Greymore line, and she was what she was, entirely and without qualification, and she let the 3 Stofong wolves make their assessment of the situation they had walked into. Riker shifted back to human form. He stood in the pre-dawn cold in the snow at the edge of the engagement, and he looked at the wolf standing the Greymore flank, and she watched him understand several things in rapid succession. He understood that the exile order had not produced the outcome it was meant to produce. He understood that the shift in capable Omega on his work roster for 3 years had been something considerably different from what her file indicated. And he understood, from the specific quality of the territorial signal she was broadcasting simply by standing where she was standing in the form she was standing in, that the calculation he had made for 3 years about the distance between them in the wolf hierarchy was not the calculation he had been living in. He had been on the wrong side of a gap he had not known existed. The main engagement was resolving. The Greymoor wolves were not losing ground, and the Stonefang formation had broken when the flank failed to close, which meant the tactical coherence of the attack was gone, and what remained was individual skirmishes that favored the defenders. 3 Stonefang wolves had already disengaged and were moving back toward the tree line. The others were following as the mathematics of the engagement made the outcome clear. Riker looked at Zara. She looked back at him. She was entirely still and entirely present, and she let him see, in the way that wolves let each other see things without words, exactly what she thought of him. Not fury. Not the desire for anything that looked like revenge. Something that was quieter and more complete than either of those things. The specific regard of something that has been underestimated for a very long time and no longer needs to do anything about it because the truth has already demonstrated itself without her assistance. He turned and walked into the trees. The engagement ended. Zara shifted back. She was standing in the snow in the thin dawn light in the clothes she had put on at 2 in the morning, and the wolf was calm inside her, and the Greymoor pack was reassembling around her, and Caius was crossing the snow toward her with 2 Greymoor wolves between shifts at his back. He looked at her. She looked at him. There was snow on his jacket and a cut above his left eyebrow that was already closing because alpha healing ran fast. He was looking at her with an expression that was doing several things simultaneously and making no effort to conceal any of them. He said everyone on the line had seen her hold the flank. She said she knew. He said the pack was going to have questions. She said she imagined so. He said he needed to know if she was all right. Not physically. He had seen her shift and shift back without a mark on her, and he knew the answer to the physical question. He was asking the other question, the one about what it had meant to stand on that flank and face Riker Cole as what she actually was for the first time in front of witnesses. Zara took a slow breath. She said it was the first time in 3 years that she had not been protecting anyone from what she was. She said it felt different from what she had expected. He said how. She said it felt like standing on solid ground. The dawn was fully arrived now, cold and clear and casting long blue shadows across the snow, and the Greymoor pack was moving around them with the specific collective energy of a community that has just survived something and is processing the survival together. And Zara stood in the middle of it and felt the wolf warm in her chest and something else alongside it that she was beginning to allow herself to name. Chapter 5. What was always hers. The formal challenge came 6 days after the Eastern Perimeter engagement. Not from the Stonefang pack. The Stonefang pack had retreated to their territory and gone quiet in the specific silence of a pack whose leadership was managing an internal reckoning. And Zara had received word through Sable that Alpha Doran had called an emergency council session the day after the engagement, and the outcome of that session had not yet been made public. She did not spend significant energy on what was happening inside the walls of the pack that had thrown her away. She had more immediate matters. The challenge came from the Iron Spire pack. They were the largest pack in the Northern Territory, 412 wolves under an alpha named Marcus Holt, who had spent the last decade systematically consolidating influence across the mountain ranges through a combination of political alliance, strategic marriage bonds, and the occasional demonstration of capability that stopped just short of the kind of open aggression that would require official intervention. He was intelligent and patient, and had the specific quality of ambition that metabolized slowly and thoroughly rather than burning fast. He had heard about the Eastern Perimeter engagement. He had heard, specifically, about the wolf who had held the Greymoor left flank. His formal challenge was addressed to the Alpha of the Greymoor pack and requested, under Northern Territory Protocol, a formal presentation of the unaffiliated wolf currently residing in Greymoor Territory under guest status, on the grounds that an unaffiliated wolf of significant capability operating without pack registration constituted a territorial concern that the Northern Oversight Body required documentation on. It was technically correct in every particular. It was also, transparently, an attempt to get Zara into a formal assessment setting where her capabilities would be on record and available to Marcus Holt's strategic calculations. Caius brought the challenge document to her directly. He sat across the table from her in the small meeting room off the main corridor, and he put the document on the table between them, and he said he wanted her to read it and tell him what she wanted to do, because the response to it was hers to determine, not his. She read it. She set it down. She said Marcus Holt was not actually concerned about unaffiliated wolf registration. She said the formal presentation request was a mechanism for putting her in a documented assessment setting, so he could evaluate what she was and decide how to use that information. Caius said he agreed with that reading. She said she had 3 options. She could refuse the formal presentation and accept whatever diplomatic friction that generated. She could attend the formal presentation and control what she demonstrated. Or she could make the question of her unaffiliated status irrelevant by formally affiliating with a pack before the presentation took place. She said the third option had implications she was not going to pretend she was unaware of. Caius said he was aware that she was aware. The room was quiet for a moment in the specific way of a room where something significant is being held carefully by 2 people who are deciding how to set it down. She said she had something she needed to say to him. He said he was listening. She said she had spent 3 years being defined by a pack that had decided what she was before they bothered to find out. She said she was not going to replicate that experience in a new location, regardless of how different the new location felt. She said the bond was real and she felt it, and she had been feeling it for 20 days, and it was not getting smaller or less clear with time, it was getting more specific, which was its own kind of information. She said she wanted to affiliate with Greymore because it was the right community for her, because the people in it had treated her like a person from the first morning. Because Sable had stood at a door 4 minutes after meeting her and told her she would not be facing things alone. She said she wanted to be here because she wanted to be here, not because the alternative was worse. She said she was saying this so he understood the difference. Caius looked at her for a long moment. He said he understood the difference. He said he had understood it from the night on the ridge when she had told him she was not asking for anything and then proceeded to tell him the truth anyway. He said he had spent 20 days understanding it more clearly with each one. He said he was not going to ask her for anything that was not freely given. He said the bond was not a contract. It was the beginning of a question that they were both qualified to answer, and they were going to answer it in whatever time and sequence felt right, and there was no version of this where he was going to mistake her choice for her obligation. Zara looked at this man who had handed her his coat on a mountain ridge and trusted her threat assessment without hesitation and declined to define her before he understood her. She said she wanted to formally affiliate with the Greymore pack. He said the affiliation protocol required a pack assembly and a formal declaration. She said she was ready whenever he was. The pack assembly was held that afternoon in the main courtyard with the mountains at its back and the winter sky enormous above it, and 160 Greymore wolves arranged in the semicircle of the formal protocol. Zara stood at the center in the deep charcoal of the new pack clothing that had appeared outside her room that morning without her asking for it, clothes fitted and well-made and entirely different from the thin utility gray of Stonefang laborer issue. And she faced the pack, and Caius stood to her right and Sable to her left, and the formal declaration was read. She accepted it. The pack acknowledged it. And then something happened that was not in the formal protocol. The young female wolf from the training yard, the one whose ground defense had the gap at the conclusion, stepped forward from the semicircle. Her name was Nara and she was 18, and she had been watching Zara with the specific attention of someone who was trying to understand something important. She stepped forward and she shifted, partial shift, her wolf coming forward in the controlled way of a practiced pack mate demonstrating respect, and she held it for the 3 seconds that the gesture required and then stepped back. Then a second wolf stepped forward and did the same. Then a third. It went around the semicircle in a wave that Zara had not expected and had no prepared response for, and she stood in the center of it and breathed through the considerable size of what it meant to be seen as belonging somewhere by 160 wolves who had known her for 20 days. Caius did not look at her during the acknowledgement sequence. He looked forward at the pack the way an alpha looked at the thing he had built. But his wolf was entirely present beside hers, and the bond between them was doing what it had been doing since the ridge. moving in the specific warm certain way of something that knew where it was and was not in a hurry because it understood it was not going anywhere. When the assembly concluded and the pack dispersed into the afternoon, Zara stood in the courtyard for a moment alone. She pressed her hand against her chest, against the place where the wolf lived. The wolf pressed back. Not the compressed urgent presence of something waiting to be released. The full settled presence of something that had finally, completely, arrived in the body and the life and the world it was made for. 3 weeks later, the Stofong pack formally retracted the exile order. Alpha Doran's council had apparently conducted its own internal review and found sufficient evidence of administrative malpractice in the original assessment records to make maintaining the order both legally indefensible and politically catastrophic. Given that the wolf in question had been formally affiliated with the Greymore pack for 21 days, and the Greymore Alpha had lodged a formal documentation request with the Northern Territory Oversight Body. The retraction arrived as a formal document. Zara read it once and handed it to Sable for the Greymore administrative files. She did not spend time on it. She had things to do. There was a gap in Nara's ground defense that had been corrected but needed consolidation work. There was a territorial mapping project she had proposed to Caius that was in its second week and producing results the council found useful. There was a formal response to Marcus Holt's presentation request that needed drafting, and she had opinions about the language it should use. She was walking to the training yard when Caius fell into step beside her. He said the retraction had come through. She said she had seen it. He said she did not seem particularly moved by it. She said she had not needed it to be over. It had been over when the gate closed behind her, and she made it to the trees. The document was administrative. The actual thing had concluded on its own terms a long time ago. He said that was a particular way of looking at it. She said it was the accurate way. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he wanted to tell her something. She said she was listening. He said he had been alpha of the Greymore pack for 7 years, and in that time had made decisions he stood behind and decisions he would revise and decisions he was still learning the full consequences of. He said he had never in 7 years made a decision that felt as certain in the making as the decision to walk toward the scent on the northern ridge on a night when any other alpha might have sent a patrol and gone back to bed. He said he was not telling her this to claim credit for something that had simply happened. He was telling her because she had said that she wanted to be here because she wanted to be here, not because the alternative was worse, and he wanted her to know that the same was true from his side. That he was standing beside her in this courtyard because he wanted to be, because the last 30 days had made the specific and unrepeatable case that she was the most honest and the most capable and the most thoroughly herself person he had encountered in 31 years of paying attention to people. He said the bond was not why. He said she was why. Zara walked for 2 more steps and then she stopped and she turned and she looked at him with the amber-flecked dark eyes that had been reading situations accurately for 22 years, and she let herself read this one without the filter she usually kept in place. What she saw was a man who meant what he said. A man who had spent 30 days demonstrating his meaning through action rather than declaration. A man whose wolf was entirely present beside hers with the warm, certain quality of something that had been patient, because it understood the patience was the point. She said she knew. She said she had known for a while. She said she was ready now. He looked at her, and something in his face that had been held carefully for 30 days finally relaxed into the full expression of what it actually was. She took 1 step toward him. He met the other half. And in the courtyard of the Greymore packhouse with the mountains at the back and the winter light clear and cold above them, the wolf that had been buried for 3 years and had finally found the world that was its scale pressed forward in her chest with the full warm certainty of something that had done exactly what she had told it she would eventually allow. It had waited. It had been right to wait. The Marcus Holt presentation request was formally declined 6 days later on the grounds that the subject of the request was now an affiliated Greymore pack member and, therefore, under the full protection of Greymore pack jurisdiction. The decline was signed by both the Pack Alpha and the Pack's newly designated Strategic Council. The position Sable had created on the council with the unanimous approval of the senior wolves on the grounds that the territorial mapping project alone had already produced operational value that the pack had no administrative category for. The designation was Zara's name. Marcus Holt sent a formal acknowledgement and requested a diplomatic meeting. Zara drafted the response herself. And in the Stofong pack, in the file room where Riker Cole had once walked past a cabinet containing falsified assessment records without a second thought, a junior pack administrator opened a folder marked Voss Z and found that the space where the documentation had been was empty. The records had been subpoenaed by the Northern Territory Oversight Body. What they found in the original assessment notes, beneath the official notation of Shift-Incapable Omega, in the handwriting of a pack healer who had recorded the truth even while being ordered not to, were 4 words that the Stofong pack had spent 3 years burying. Sovereign Wolf. Do not suppress. They had suppressed her anyway. She had come back anyway. And she was not coming back as the girl who had survived them. She was coming back as the wolf they had never been ready for. That is the story of Zara Voss. The Omega they threw into the snow on the coldest night of the year. The wolf that survived the forest and the rejection and the 3 years of being defined by people who had no idea what they were defining. The woman who walked into a new pack and held the flank and told the truth and chose her life on her own terms. If this story moved you, if Zara is the kind of wolf heroine you have been waiting for, then do these 4 things right now. Subscribe so you never miss a story like this again. Leave a comment and tell us which moment hit you the hardest. Was it the forest shift, the ridge, the left flank, or the courtyard assembly? Share the story with everyone who deserves a wolf romance that does not ask its heroine to be grateful for survival. And like this video because it tells us to keep making stories about wolves who get back up. Subscribe, like, comment, share.